I love philosophy. It's taught me a lot about who I am, what I want, and how to achieve it. I love it so much that I've spent thousands of dollars just so I can put a little paper on my wall that says that I'm a master of it. But there seems to be some kind of problem with engagement and retention with philosophy in particular. I can't tell you how many students I've had who obviously have some philosophical tendencies, but are intimidated by the discipline. Most colleges have a philosophy general ed requirement, but for a lot of students that seems to be their problem area with their gen eds. There's a lot of questions of like, why bother, Why do I need to ponder what happiness is? I'll just know it when I feel it. But still, in a time like right now, it feels like philosophy is more important than ever. How are we supposed to face existential threats like we've never seen before, when the thoughtfulness that the discipline is meant to nurture in us seems too abstract and intense for general audiences? Almost every philosopher I know believes to some extent that we should teach more philosophy in schools. And I'm no exception to that. I tell my undergrad peers all the time that a second major or even a minor in philosophy will be a huge boon to their education. But is that really the solution here? More philosophy in schools? It might be if we were talking about grade schools, but let's be honest, with the Department of Education maybe going away, it's not even really that relevant to talk about. I don't even know how much it's taught in grade schools currently. I can tell you with certainty that I didn't take my first philosophy course until I was well into undergrad. I'm not even sure that attacking the engagement problem from the ground up, meaning start them when they're young, is really the issue here. At least, not without looking at the method of engagement first. So who's to blame for this disengagement anyway? I mean, it seems unfair to blame general audiences, right? Philosophy is done in those moments where you have time to sit down and reflect on your life. But who even has time to do that these days? Especially when there are ways to become a thoughtful, free-thinking, reflective adult without having to read through the entire history of the development of thought. But I'm also not going to sit here and blame philosophers either. But maybe, just maybe, there is something that we as philosophers can be more considerate of in doing our work. When the development of thought is done behind closed doors and with language that is inaccessible to the general audience, we can't bang our heads against the wall and wonder why they aren't interested in the field. Philosophers have been the most inspiring people to me in my life. But I'll tell you, it's not because I'm a logical person and I found their reasoning convincing. I think what makes philosophy really special is that the people who do it have a passion for life as a whole. So for this video, I want to take a look at philosophy as a field driven by passion and wonder how we have, can, and should continue to engage those passions in order to engage with general audiences. I want to take the opportunity in this essay to think about general audiences, the people to which philosophy is generally directed outside of classrooms and academia as a whole. My aim in this essay is going to be to make my field more accessible to general audiences. In order to do so, we need to solve a few problems. We need to know what that audience is like, what appeals to that audience, and if that's applicable in philosophy. To start, I'm going to borrow some terms from my friend David Hume in order to understand what it means to be a philosophical anatomist versus a philosophical painter. By understanding the anatomy of philosophy, I want to know how I can paint philosophies that are going to be accessible to anybody. Philosophical anatomy and painting are terms that David Hume uses throughout his works to describe different forms of philosophy. In his first major work as a philosopher, A Treatise of Human Nature, Hume only really focuses on the distinction in the last paragraph. But later in his life, in An Enquiry on Human Understanding, Hume focuses more on the distinction in the first section. Kate Abramson, a Hume scholar at Indiana University, outlines 4 very helpful distinctions on what makes one a philosophical painter versus anatomist in her Compass article on the topic. These are audience, style, world engagement, and how they view human nature. Let's start by talking about those philosophers who lay the groundwork for everyone else, the anatomists. Anatomists aim at an audience who are more like them, fellow anatomists, as Abramson puts it. Anatomists have a style that's more cool and abstract. It's that abstractness in particular that helps them in engaging with philosophical principles. By engaging with principles, the anatomist can aim at questions of a deeper human understanding. Oh, and importantly, they consider human nature to be reasonable. Painters, on the other hand, aim at an audience who is generally intelligent and literate. This isn't dissimilar to advice that I've given and received for college-level writing. You want to aim at an audience who will generally get what you're doing, but maybe isn't an expert in the field. Painters also write in a voice that's more easy and engaging. To be clear, easy is not meant to be demeaning to general audiences in any way. It just means that their approach is more easygoing, unlike the anatomist who might have a more scientific or mathematical approach to things. With this easy and engaging style, painters are engaging with observations of common life. This might bring to mind somebody like Plato, who will say things like, imagine someone in a cave. This is how they probably would behave. And painters finally consider human nature to be, and I quote, chiefly as born for action. An important distinction that I think often gets left out of the anatomist-painter discussion is a question of purpose. When I'm thinking about the painter, I'm thinking about developing thought for society as a whole. I'm not thinking about developing philosophy internally. Picture it this way. The anatomical philosopher is the one who's walking through these academic buildings where they can go into any given classroom and talk to their coworker, their classmate, or their professor and use all of these crazy words like metaphysics, epistemology, or Immanuel Kant. We also have to note that each distinct philosopher serves each other in important ways. The painter couldn't do what they do if it weren't for the work of the anatomist. The way that I'm interpreting it for our purposes here is that the painter does more of a call for action. Their job is to present philosophy in a way that people can interpret it, internalize it, and then enact it. Think of what we're doing here in terms of this easel. If the anatomist didn't put this together with their scientific, mathematical approach, I never would have been able to make this beautiful artwork. I didn't say I was an actual painter. And this seems to be exactly what I want to aim for in reaching a general audience with philosophy. The painter is looking to make philosophies that are generally accessible to anybody, even if they don't necessarily do philosophy, or at least that they don't dedicate their lives to it. It's the what's the deal with airplane food of philosophy. It's accessible to anybody. However, something that I struggled with in Hume's distinction was the question of whether philosophers and anatomists can be doing both philosophy and anatomy in individual works, or even as individual philosophers themselves. For example, Hume references Marcus Tullius Cicero, the Roman orator, senator, and philosopher. Cicero was a captivating and complex philosopher, so complex that Tobias Reinhardt once argued that there are 4 distinct characters of Cicero in his academic skepticism alone. And Hume references Cicero as a painter right alongside Aristotle as an anatomist, which is pretty significant, because where Cicero most likely painted the most in his life was actually not in his philosophy per se, but rather in his public speaking, in his political use of rhetoric. So with Aristotle being the anatomist and Cicero being the painter, I have to wonder, are we talking about Cicero as the philosopher here? Or are we talking about him as an orator? Is Cicero the orator equivalent to the painter for Hume? I think that there's a way we could reframe that, though. I think the better question for us is, could Cicero, as a philosopher, be all of these things? Could Cicero, the philosopher, also be Cicero the senator, Cicero the orator, and Cicero the painter? Aristotle analyzes the art of rhetoric in his book of that very name. Rhetoric is, in short, the art of argumentation. It's not just doing arguments, but it's analyzing and pursuing exactly how you want to do those arguments. Not unlike what we're doing here. Aristotle's main argument about rhetoric is that your arguments cannot be solely guided by logos, by reason. You also have to make yourself out to be trustworthy to your audience, that's ethos, and you need to appeal to their emotions, that's pathos. Which sounds quite a lot like what I'm arguing we should do with philosophical painting. But before getting into any of the weeds of particular emotions or what the anatomy of an emotion itself is, Aristotle tells us in Book 2 what qualities inspire confidence in the orator's character. That's ethos, making oneself out to be a trustworthy source. These are practical wisdom, virtue, and goodwill. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of translations, what virtue is, and so forth. If you're interested in what virtue is, you can read this book. But it sounds to me like what Aristotle is saying in general is that a good rhetorician should be aware of what they're doing. By having practical wisdom, they have to be aware of their own state of mind. By having virtue, They have to be aware of why they're in that state. And by having goodwill, they have to wish well by the audience for the audience's own sake. Aristotle then encourages us to know our audience by way of the emotions, by way of pathos. He says that things do not appear the same to those who love and to those who hate. And in doing so, he's encouraging us to know the audience we're addressing. Are they loving or are they hating? My audience are always haters, professional haters. To understand to the best of our abilities what emotions it is we're engaging with, and to poke at those to the best of our ability. Once again, when considering a philosophy that is accessible, we come back to this term, awareness. Awareness of both others and of ourselves. By understanding not only what other people are like, but also what we're like, we're able to efficiently guide our arguments to an effective end. And by understanding and engaging with those emotions in our audience, we're leaving the door open for anyone, lover, hater, whomever, to take part in the development of ideas. But before we get all excited because the philosopher himself approves of our idea, is this straying too far from philosophy itself? Aristotle's Rhetoric does indeed encourage an engagement with the emotions and an understanding of the self, but that's for rhetoric, that's as an orator. And that actually just presents more of a problem for my initial concern, that being whether you can be both a painter and an anatomist in one philosophical work, or even as one philosopher. Maybe the definition we're creating for painters is just equating them to orators, or to politicians, or whoever it might be that uses this rhetoric. So yes, you might be able to argue on a Reinhardt-like approach that Cicero the orator is different than Cicero the philosopher. His oration is his painting, and his philosophy is his anatomy. But I'm going to take a different, vaguely Humean approach to this instead. Early on in the Enquiry, he tells us to, quote, be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophy, be still a man. I think it's not unreasonable to add to that amidst all your humanity, you need to find all of the pieces of yourself. Within each politician, there's an orator. Within each orator, there's also a philosopher. And within each anatomist, there is a painter. This idea of awareness seems to me to be exactly the kind of appeal that we're looking to paint with in order to make accessible philosophies. And by being open to those emotions from our audience, we're leaving the door open for anyone to engage with the development of ideas. Now, before we just run off and start developing new ideas, we do have to look back and wonder, has this been done before? Can it be done while still calling it, pure philosophy? I mean, is maybe the problem that most philosophers are just pure anatomists? Maybe that's the barrier that's being created for general audiences. Or are most philosophers actually like Cicero? They're painters with many layers. I obviously can't speak for most philosophers, and I can't even speak for all of history, but I can certainly speak for the origins of philosophy and for contemporary philosophers, and tell you that there are certainly examples of people using pathos in their work throughout history. Philosophy all really started right here. Not here on this random beach in my hometown, but somewhere in Greece on the other side of the world, where someone was just sitting and taking in the world. It started with curiosity. The pre-Socratics, those being the philosophers who came before Socrates, were what we might now consider natural philosophers. They were a little bit more like scientists. The only tool they really wielded was their mind and the power of observation. Everything they did was just like sitting on a beach like this, taking in the world. And it's hard for me to imagine curiosity as anything more than an emotion. It's certainly an emotion that drives you to desire reason, to desire understanding of the world. But it's just this feeling deep inside of you that makes you want to understand everything. And it makes you want your fellow person to understand it just as much as you do, and to desire that reason just as much as you do. But looking at the ancients and the pre-ancients and the Neanderthals and the whole history of philosophy isn't the only way to consider what philosophy is or ought to be. There are plenty of contemporary examples of philosophers who use pathos in their works, and also philosophers who make a clear call to action. In her 1997 book, Cultivating Humanity, Martha Nussbaum consistently uses pathos to appeal to her audience's empathy. She opens a few of her chapters with stories about individuals who have been affected by certain aspects of liberal education. Chapter 2, Citizens of the World, opens right out the gate with a character's name. Anna was a political science major at a large state university in the Midwest. Upon graduation, she went into business, getting a promising job with a large firm. She then goes on to explain Anna's upcoming job, which will move her to China, and all of the things that she might experience there. In situating us neatly with a real person with a real name, and then rattling off all of these things in an attempt to overwhelm us, Nussbaum effectively activates our empathy and tries to overwhelm us as Anna would be. Having now activated our empathy, Nussbaum goes on to argue that liberal education has not prepared students to be, as the chapter title said, students of the world. Nussbaum is a fantastic example if we're looking for guides of people who paint with their philosophies. Her works aren't just for the people who work down the hall. They're also for general audiences. For example, educators who are looking to reform their classrooms, parents who have a vested interest in their children's futures, or just people as a whole who care about the education system. Allegedly. This all seems pretty good to me. Based on the guidance of both Aristotle and Hume, we have a good understanding of what the philosophical painter ought to do. We need to build on the guidance of the Anatomists before us, we need to understand the audience at hand, and we need to use Pathos and Ethos in our works. All seems pretty clear-cut. Except, something is bothering me. That whole, what is the audience at hand like thing. What is the audience like? I don't know. We forgot logos! We forgot logos! So that's kind of a big problem, because I'm working on an argument that invokes philosophy from the very beginning, trying to argue that there's valid use for pathos in philosophy. But from the beginning, logos is famously central to the discipline. I mean, it goes back as far as those pre-Socratic guys that I mentioned, with Heraclitus getting all mad because people just didn't seem to care as much about logos as he did. And that's not even to mention that Aristotle himself, who we've been using this whole time, said that humans are rational beings. What separates us from animals, he says, is that we can approach things reasonably, that we have the ability for speech even. So we're sitting here talking about how Aristotle has this great rhetorical approach that utilizes emotions, but those emotions aren't the main directive of human beings. So for Aristotle, we're not even emotion-driven people. So this whole concept of awareness of the audience isn't even really pathos at all, at least the way that we understand it in a contemporary way. Or it is pathos, but it's just pathos that's somehow guided or directed by logos. Which doesn't make the audience that we want to get at emotion-driven at all, but reason-driven. So their emotions are just slave to their reasons. Why do I feel like I've heard that before? Ought is a term that our friend David Hume had a complicated relationship with. In his famous is-ought distinction, Hume argued that you cannot derive what ought to be from what is. This is important to know for how Hume then defines human nature. He battens down and says that reason is and ought only to be a slave to the passions. So here we have an empirical philosopher, someone who wants us to understand the world through sensory experience, claiming that human nature is emotion-driven. Now there's an obvious concern here. If that's the case, does that include philosophers? I mean, it doesn't really feel right to me. I'm a philosopher, I'm also an anatomist. That obviously means that I'm reason-driven. Right? Let's talk first about the emotions and the passions in Hume. Both are what he calls secondary impressions. They are impressions which are caused by an idea or a primary impression. That means they're also of original existence. They're not represented by anything. They simply are. Given that they're of original existence, they also can't really be truth-apt. Passions simply exist. So to call them untruthful or unreasonable would kind of be absurd. Let's look at a simple example that I know a lot of you will get. The desire for a sweet treat. Imagine you're me and you just have a sudden desire for coffee. That desire could come from a few places. Maybe it is just a desire for a sweet treat, like a yummy latte or a flavored brew. Or maybe I need some energy, so I just want like a simple black coffee. Or maybe I just smelled someone else's coffee and that coffee addicted part of my brain got activated. What Hume is trying to say is that while there may be unreasonable approaches to said desire, calling the desire itself unreasonable would be absurd. Choosing to get the coffee despite having had no water today would be unreasonable, but choosing to follow the desire and have the coffee and also drinking enough water would be completely reasonable. I'll let you guess which one I did. I don't know why I'm getting a cramp. If you think about it, this whole idea has some pretty contemporary counterparts. Think about the phrase, "your emotions are valid." It's one of the many therapy phrases that's made its way into the zeitgeist. And all it really means is that there's nothing you can do about your emotions by reasoning them through. All you have to do is feel them. But then, and yes, this is a criticism of some of you who use that line, your actions need to be somewhat more reasonably approached. So when Hume says that reason ought only to be the slave to the passions, all he's saying is that it would be absurd to call an emotion itself unreasonable. The claim he's staking is that you can't just reason your way through something that simply exists. Hume's not encouraging us to go crazy and let our rage out with every little instinct we have, but he is encouraging us to not think of our emotions as things to be rationalized and then disregarded. The emotions are part of us, where reason is just a copy of the world that helps us understand everything. With this understanding of what the emotions and passions are, and that we are beings driven by them, it's clear how Hume would then characterize philosophers. Remember that quote from earlier, "Amidst all your philosophy, be still a man." That also means that within your philosophizing, remember that you're passionate. Philosophers are, it seems, just beings who are passionate about reason. And that doesn't just mean philosophical painters. Remember that anatomists are meant to aim at an audience who are like them, which means an audience who is also just passionate about reason and rationality. And then painters aim at an audience who are chiefly born for action. Something I didn't really touch on in the last section is that Hume does say that our actions are directed by passions, specifically the direct passions, these ones. These passions direct our actions. So it seems to me that a person who is chiefly born for action is somebody who is directed by their passion. In other words, a normal person. So the mission of the painter is to reach across the aisle of our reason-drivenness and to say, hey, I'm also born for action. I'm also passionate. What do you want to talk about today? Which seems simple enough, but remember our original problem. What do we do with audience who are already disengaged or disinterested in the field? I've worked the entire time that I've been here at Fordham at our writing center, tutoring students in both general writing skills and also in philosophy, which isn't technically in my job description, but one day they just happened to find me, and now I'm doomed to help them forever. And it's interesting to see these young students and think about how they're beginning to engage with things. I have students from all different disciplines, so some of them come in very excited to do philosophy with me if that's the assignment we're doing, and then others will come in for philosophy assignments rolling their eyes. It's that disengagement problem we began this whole essay with. But then I think back to when I was their age. I came into college studying media. I just wanted to be a filmmaker. And then somewhere along the way, it occurred to me that all of the themes within philosophy not only resonated with me personally, but could really help me to tell stories that I wanted to tell. So I took a few electives, one thing led to another, and boom, now I'm here. And I see the same inkling with a lot of these students. You know, they come in with a glaze over their eyes. A lot of them come in just to get extra credit for their classes, so they don't really care about getting the work done. They just want to make sure they can get a pass on this paper and call it a day. But then the second that I engage with them in a way that kind of interests them, you know, ask them what their major is, try to relate philosophy to it, whatever it might be, suddenly they snap to attention. You know, it makes sense why they want to be doing this thing. So at this point in the video, you've probably seen a lot of the vloggy stuff where I talk about all of the stuff that went down trying to film up Nonianta. This is a little behind the scenes. My car broke down. I'm in Cooks Falls, New York. I'm 70, I'm rounding, 60 miles from Oneonta. It's raining. I bought an easel earlier today for the artist scenes. And yeah, we're just gonna see how this goes. I saw a black cat. I literally pulled into an auto repair shop, which was closed, by the way, and sitting in front of me drinking from a puddle is a black cat. I'm in Downsville. My car is at a repair shop that isn't open till Monday. I'm gonna kill us both! Ah! It's currently Friday before my project is due, and yesterday I went up to Oneonta to get my car. I ended up going to shoot one last scene. It was the title scene that you saw, where I'm standing on the dock in a different outfit, and I ended up sitting in on one of my old professor's classes. And he did a thing in the class that I feel like I've seen him do before that was really interesting, where he guides the class towards this question of why, and eventually ends up asking, why are you here? And the answer ultimately, especially in a freshman class, which this was, is because I have to be. It was kind of funny because he made a joke that I'm sure was like scripted, quote unquote, where he was like, I'm sad for you guys. I'm the only one who wants to be here. And I'm kind of sitting in the back like, I want to be here, doctor. But then it's like, I think it was like 15 minutes before the class ended. And he's like, so what would you rather be doing? And most of them are like, I want to be sleeping. I want to be partying. I want to be, doing that. Someone said I want to be playing Warzone. Shout out to that kid. Play a better game. I'm just kidding. And then he just let him go. They left 15 minutes early. And I got time after that then to speak with him and talk about the class he's teaching. And then I had time to go talk to my roommate and hang out with him for a little bit before I went home. And it's like, he took that second to kind of engage with them. And it was he spent most of the class trying to get them to answer questions from the reading. And, they're all freshmen. They didn't do the reading, calling you out. And that's something that we kind of talked about with the Anatomist, right? This idea of using complex language that might be a little bit problematic in certain ways because it does create a bar of entry to the field. So maybe, and this is literally just me thinking out loud, maybe what this is all about is philosophers learning to take a step back and speak, the people's tongue, speak like a normal person and not try to trip people up. I don't know. Just a thought. So thinking way back to the beginning, maybe the solution really with the engagement problem is just engaging. Taking a second to brush the I love philosophy chip off our shoulders and just talk to the students about the things that they care about, that we can relate philosophy as an academic discipline to. Even if that means talking about stoicism with business majors. Fuck. But seriously, maybe it's not about a question of pain or pleasure. Originally in this script, I had this whole argument that maybe philosophy is most often done when we're feeling pain and we're seeking pleasure, or at least understanding. And I think that's still kind of accurate. But maybe it's just about seeking understanding via the things that give us pleasure. For philosophers, that's reason. I find pleasure in trying to understand the world, trying to reason through things. But for others, maybe it's about finding reason and understanding through the things that bring them pleasure, through the things they are passionate about. Within all of this, I am still left with one last concern. Now, if you're very clever, you might have already figured out who this video was largely inspired by. Abigail Thorne, the woman behind Philosophy Tube, has been doing videos on YouTube for the last 11 years, and her use of pathos in her videos is genuinely incredible. In a somewhat recent video on Judith Butler, Abigail, a trans woman, intercut her essay with an interview with herself pre-transition. While usually Abigail makes jokes about her channel previously being run by her brother, in this video she embraces her trans identity to talk about a controversial gender theorist. The central focus of that video, however, as well as a few of the recent videos on her channel, was the concept of phantasms. A phantasm is a philosophical concept that essentially means a personal fantasy, at least the way that Abigail and I are using it. It's a lens through which you see the world. So I suppose the concern that I mentioned before is any kind of emotional appeal that we're going to do in philosophy just going to come off as some kind of fear-mongering? I mean, if everybody already has these personal fantasies through which they're seeing the world, are we just sort of abusing this irrational, passion-driven nature that we've established by doing appeals to emotion? I mean, it feels that way a lot these days, doesn't it? The whole concern of this essay has been, how do we make our field more accessible to non-philosophy pilled individuals? But if everybody is already caught up in their own personal fantasies, in their own phantasms, does that even matter? If we're all so haunted by our pain, why does it even matter to seek or to appeal to that pleasure? It's funny though. I'm making this whole argument about how we should encourage more engagement with emotions within philosophy, and then I'm getting all nervous about how we're going to use that engagement and pass people's fantasies. But speaking of fantasy, do you know how I actually got into philosophy? This little thing. Playing Dungeons & Dragons and watching D&D shows. Particularly these two guys, Brennan Lee Mulligan and Allie Beardsley on Dimension 20. They might hate to hear that. I know that they both got degrees in philosophy and are now in entertainment, something that I frankly might end up doing too, at least for a while. But it's true that the themes that they put into their silly little D&D show were exactly what I needed back in the 2020 quarantine. And after returning to school, it was because of those themes that I knew that philosophy was the right field of study for me. Studying philosophy has almost entirely changed my life. It's given me a sense of purpose. And I've had conversations with lots of friends and classmates who have experienced exactly the same. I remember one particular conversation that I had with a classmate about coming to terms with their identity, learning to love and care about themselves. And they said that it all happened with just studying philosophy. That's what this field can give us, and importantly, can give everyone. That's what an empathetic approach to academia can give people. And you're probably sitting there right now, feeling pretty sentimental about this whole journey we've been on. And you're thinking, wow, that was a really nice story he told. Maybe he's got a point about this whole painting with philosophy thing. Gotcha.